John Miller was ridiculed when he tried to buy a $1 million ranch, but what nobody knew, he was one of the country's largest agricultural producers. When he returned with a check in hand, those who mocked him were left speechless. An unforgettable lesson was about to be taught. The dust rose in small whirlwinds as the old faded blue Ford F-150 snaked along the dirt road leading to Oak Ridge Ranch. John Miller, a 45-year-old man with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands, drove with determination. His simple clothes, a faded plaid shirt, worn jeans and dusty boots, contrasted with the luxury that began to reveal itself as he approached the property's main house. The ranch was known throughout the region as the Jewel of the Valley. With its 3,000 acres of fertile land, majestic main house in colonial style, and modern facilities, it represented the dream of any farmer. For John, it was more than that. It was the materialization of 2 decades of hard work and meticulous planning. As he parked in front of the main house, he noticed the disdainful looks from the employees moving around the place. Through the large windows, he could see Robert Thompson, the current owner, talking with some men in suits. John adjusted his worn hat, took a deep breath, and got out of the car. "Can I help you?" The voice laden with irony came from one of the foremen, Charlie, who approached with an air of superiority. "I came to talk to Mr. Thompson about selling the property," John replied, maintaining his dignity in the face of the other's mocking gaze. The foreman laughed openly. "The boss is in an important meeting. He doesn't have time for—" "Let him in, Charlie," Robert Thompson's deep voice echoed from the porch. The owner, a tall man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in an Italian suit, watched the scene with amusement in his eyes. John crossed the courtyard, feeling the weight of the stairs upon him. The businessmen present whispered and laughed discreetly, while the secretaries exchanged meaningful glances. The contrast between his simple figure and the sophisticated environment couldn't have been greater. "So," Robert began, leaning back in his leather chair, "I heard you're interested in buying my ranch." His tone was pure mockery. "Yes, sir," John replied, maintaining a firm posture. "I'd like to know the price." Robert looked at his guests, who were trying to contain their laughter. "Well, considering the prime location, modern facilities, 3,000 acres of prime land, let's say 50 million. The silence that followed was cut by contained laughter. Robert continued, "And that's a friend's price. After all, you seem to be a hard-working man." The last word came out loaded with condescension. To everyone's surprise, John didn't flinch. "I accept," he said simply. "I'll be back tomorrow with my lawyer to sort out the details." The laughter was now open. Robert stood up, amused. Of course, we'll be waiting anxiously." The sarcasm in his voice was palpable. John withdrew with the same dignity with which he had entered. As he walked back to his truck, he could hear the mocking comments. "He must have been drinking. He's delusional. Where have you ever seen—" What no one knew was that inside that old truck was a man who had built a silent empire. John was known in 3 states as the Cotton King, although he preferred to maintain a discreet profile. His properties, strategically distributed and masterfully managed, generated significant profits, but he had never abandoned his humble origins. As he drove back, John thought about his journey. He had started as a migrant worker, saving every penny he earned. His first piece of land had been a small farm, bought with a lot of sweat. From there on, each investment had been meticulously planned. His simplicity wasn't a lack of resources, but a conscious choice, a constant reminder of his origins and values. In his private office, set up in a modest house in town, John picked up the phone. On the other end of the line, Dr. Mark Wilson, his lawyer for over a decade, listened attentively to the day's account. "Prepare all the documentation, Mark," John instructed, "and do a complete survey of the ranch's financial situation. I have a hunch we're going to find some interesting surprises." The lawyer smiled on the other end of the line. He knew that tone of voice well. It was the same one that had preceded some of his clients' most brilliant moves over the years. That night, while Robert Thompson and his friends were probably laughing at the Hicks audacity, John was reviewing spreadsheets and reports on his computer. The information revealed on the screen confirmed his suspicions. Oak Ridge Ranch, despite its imposing appearance, was drowning in debt. Robert's arrogance had blinded him to the reality of his own disastrous management. The sun was already setting when John finally turned off the computer. Tomorrow would be a decisive day, not just for him, but for all those who had judged him by his appearance. The lesson he was about to teach would be memorable, not out of vengeance, but out of justice. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. The following morning dawned with a soft mist covering the fields of Oak Ridge Ranch. Robert Thompson was in his office, savoring his imported coffee, when his secretary announced the arrival of a delegation. His mocking smile froze as he saw John Miller entering, no longer alone but accompanied by 3 people in impeccable executive attire. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," the deep, professional voice of the tallest man echoed through the room. "I'm Dr. Mark Wilson, Mr. Miller's lawyer. These are Sarah Johnson, our financial consultant, and Richard Davis, our agricultural assessor." Robert swallowed hard, his face losing some color. He knew those names well. They were respected professionals in the market, people who wouldn't waste their time with unfounded proposals. "We've brought all the necessary documentation to finalize the purchase," Dr. Mark continued, placing a leather folder on the desk, "including a check for the agreed amount of $50 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert picked up the check with trembling hands, his eyes widening as he confirmed its authenticity. It was real, completely real. But how?" he stammered, looking at John as if seeing him for the first time. Sarah Johnson, the financial consultant, opened her laptop. "Mr. Thompson, during our preliminary analysis, we identified some irregularities in your financial operations. Are you aware that your ranch has accumulated considerable debts with suppliers and banks?" Robert paled even more. Of course he was aware. The debts had been consuming him for months, but he kept up appearances at all costs, hoping for a miracle that would save his situation. "As part of the agreement," Dr. Mark continued, "Mr. Miller will also assume all the property's debts. However, this will mean a significant discount on the final value, considering the identified liabilities." At this moment, Charlie, the foreman who had mocked John the day before, rushed into the room. "Boss, the suppliers are outside. They're demanding payment for the last 3 shipments of supplies." Robert sank into his chair, defeated. His empire of appearances was crumbling before his eyes. John, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Mr. Thompson, contrary to what you might think, I'm not here to humiliate you. I've learned throughout life that a man's true value isn't in his clothes or the car he drives, but in his character and how he treats others." The room fell into complete silence. The employees who had gathered at the door, attracted by the unusual movement, watched the scene in amazement. "I have a proposal," John continued. "In addition to assuming the debts, I offer a dignified transition. You'll have 3 months to organize your departure, and your employees will have the opportunity to remain in their positions as long as they demonstrate competence and dedication." Robert raised his eyes, surprised by the unexpected generosity. "Why?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Because transforming people through example is more powerful than through humiliation," John replied simply. The following hours were dedicated to legal procedures. While Dr. Mark and Sarah took care of the paperwork, Richard Davis, the agronomist, began a detailed inspection of the property. The buzz spread through the corridors of the ranch, and the same employees who had previously laughed at John now watched him with a mixture of respect and apprehension. During the inspection, it was discovered that in addition to financial debts, the ranch faced serious management problems. Expensive equipment was abandoned due to lack of maintenance, fertile areas were underutilized, and the irrigation system, which had cost a fortune, operated at only 60% of its capacity. "It's incredible how someone can have so much and manage so poorly," Richard commented, making notes on his clipboard. "With proper management, this property can double its productivity in 2 years." John listened attentively, already planning the necessary changes. His sharp business mind, combined with practical experience in agriculture, visualized the untapped potential of Oak Ridge Ranch. At the end of the afternoon, when the last documents were signed, Robert Thompson left his office for the last time as owner. As he passed John, he stopped briefly. I'm sorry for the way I treated you," he said with difficulty. John nodded. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to see what really matters," he replied. As the sun set on the horizon, casting golden shadows across the fields, John remained on the porch of the main house, now his. He watched the workers returning to their homes, thinking about how he would transform not just the ranch, but the lives of all those families who depended on it. Sarah approached with some spreadsheets. "John, I need to show you some numbers. The situation is even more complex than we imagined." "Tomorrow, Sarah," he replied, still contemplating the landscape. "Today, I just want to be grateful for having come this far and think about how to make a difference in these people's lives." The wind blew gently, bringing the smell of earth and the promise of better days. Oak Ridge Ranch was about to write a new chapter in its history, under the leadership of a man who had never forgotten his origins, even after building an empire. A week after the purchase of Oak Ridge Ranch, John organized a meeting with all employees in the large central barn. The nervousness was palpable in the air. Many feared mass layoffs. Others speculated about drastic changes that could affect their lives. Charlie, the former foreman, was particularly restless. His previous arrogance had given way to poorly disguised anxiety. After all, he had been one of the main protagonists in the mockery of the new boss. "Good morning, everyone," John began, his calm voice echoing through the barn. "I know you have many questions about the future. Today I want to share with you not just my plans for the ranch, but also my story." The silence was absolute as John narrated his journey. He told about his days as a migrant worker, the night studying by candlelight, the first acre conquered. He spoke about how he learned to value each person, regardless of their position, and how he built his empire based on respect and competence. "You met me arriving in an old F-150, wearing simple clothes. Many laughed, others despised." His eyes scanned the audience, briefly stopping on faces that now showed shame. "But do you know why I maintain this simplicity? Because it reminds me daily of where I came from and the values that brought me here." Sarah Johnson, who was sitting near the improvised stage, stood up with some folders in hand. "Excuse me, John, I think it's time to show the numbers." Through a projector, Sarah presented graphs and spreadsheets that revealed the true situation of the ranch. The debts were even larger than initially thought, but that wasn't all. There was also evidence of systematic mismanagement and even misappropriation of resources. Charlie shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He knew much more than he showed, and fear began to consume him. "We discovered," Sarah continued, "that in the last 3 years, approximately 30% of the purchased supplies never actually reached the ranch. Can anyone explain this?" The heavy silence was broken by a trembling voice from the back of the barn. It was Mrs. Betty, one of the ranch's oldest employees. "I can explain, Mr. Miller, but I've always been afraid to speak up." All eyes turned to the gray-haired lady who had worked in the main house's kitchen for 20 years. With a choked voice, she revealed a complex scheme of misappropriations that involved not just ranch employees, but also suppliers and even influential people in the region. Charlie stood up abruptly, walking towards the exit, but was stopped by Richard Davis, the agronomist, who was blocking the door. "You don't need to run, Charlie," John said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm not here to punish, but to transform. Each of you will have the chance to start over, as long as you choose the path of honesty from now on." The tension in the environment began to dissipate when John presented his restructuring plan. It included not just improvements in infrastructure, but also training programs for employees, benefits for families, and an innovative profit-sharing system. "From today on," he announced, "each of you will be not just an employee, but a partner in the growth of this ranch. Those who choose to stay and dedicate themselves will have the opportunity to grow with us." Sarah then revealed another surprising fact. With the new management plan, the ranch's productivity could triple in 3 years. "And that means," she added, "that everyone here can have a better life." During the course of the meeting, old stories from the ranch began to emerge. Employees who previously feared speaking now shared their experiences, their frustrations, and also their hopes. To many surprise, John listened to each account with genuine interest, taking notes and occasionally asking for more details. Charlie, who remained silent in his corner, observed the transformation happening before his eyes. The man he had belittled was not only forgiving past mistakes, but offering a better future for everyone. At the end of the meeting, when most had already left, Charlie approached John. "Why didn't you fire me?" he asked, his voice laden with guilt. John smiled. "Because I believe people can change when given a second chance. Besides, you know this ranch better than anyone. With your experience turned towards good, we can do great things here." That night, as John reviewed the latest reports in his new office, he received an unexpected visit. It was Mrs. Betty, bringing a cup of coffee and a yellowed envelope. "Mr. Miller, there's something you need to see," she said, handing him the envelope. "I've kept this for a long time, waiting for the right moment." Inside the envelope were old photographs and documents that revealed a surprising connection between the history of Oak Ridge Ranch and John's family. A revelation that would forever change his understanding of the destiny that had brought him here. With trembling hands, John spread the photographs on his desk. In one of them, yellowed by time, a young worker smiled next to a coffee plantation. His eyes, the same eyes John saw every day in the mirror, shone with hope. "This was your father, Joseph Miller, Mrs." Betty explained, her voice filled with emotion. "He worked on this ranch for 15 years during the time of the former owner, Samuel Rogers." John picked up the photograph, feeling a lump in his throat. His father had left when he was only 5 years old, leaving him with his mother and many unanswered questions. "Samuel was different from Robert," Mrs. Betty continued. "He was a fair man, treated the employees like family. Your father was the most dedicated foreman this ranch ever had." As Mrs. Betty spoke, John examined the documents. Among them, he found something that made his heart race: an old contract, promising his father a part of the ranch as payment for years of dedicated service. "What happened?" John asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Samuel suddenly fell ill," Mrs. Betty replied, wiping away a tear. "Before he passed, he left everything documented about the part that belonged to your father. But Robert, his nephew and heir, hid the documents. Your father, devastated by the injustice, couldn't bear to stay here." The revelation hit John like lightning. His father hadn't simply abandoned the family. He had been a victim of an injustice that broke him inside. All his work, his savings, his dreams had been stolen. The next morning, John gathered all the employees again. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Fear had given way to expectation, and even Charlie showed a new attitude. "Yesterday," John began, "I discovered that my history with this ranch began much earlier than I imagined. My father, Joseph Miller, worked on this land, dreamed of it, and part of it should have been his by right." A murmur of surprise ran through the barn. Some older employees looked at each other, remembering the past. "But I'm not here to correct just an injustice of the past," he continued. "I'm here to ensure that no other injustice happens on this land." John then revealed his most audacious plan: the creation of a cooperative that would allow employees to gradually become co-owners of parts of the ranch through a system of goals and profit sharing. "Oak Ridge Ranch will no longer be a place where a few profit at the expense of many people's work," he declared. "It will be an example of how agriculture can thrive through partnership and mutual respect." Sarah presented the details of the plan. The employees listened with growing attention as she explained how each of them could, through their work and dedication, build their own wealth. Jack, who had been observing everything with tears in his eyes, asked to speak. "Mr. Thompson, I need to confess something. Your father, he tried to tell me about the documents before he left. I was young, had just started here, and I was afraid of losing my job if I helped. This guilt has haunted me for years and maybe explains why I became so bitter." Anthony crossed the barn and, to everyone's surprise, extended his hand to Jack. "The past can't be changed, but the future is in our hands. Your experience will be crucial in transforming this ranch into what it always should have been." In the months that followed, Oak Ridge Ranch underwent an extraordinary transformation. Productivity increased, debts were being paid off, and most importantly, people worked with a new sparkle in their eyes, the sparkle of those who know they're building something greater than themselves. One particular afternoon, Anthony found himself again with Mrs. Betty on the porch of the main house. She smiled, watching the workers returning to their homes. "You know, Mr. Thompson," she said, "your father used to say that a ranch isn't just made of land and crops, but of the people who dedicate their lives to it." Today, seeing all this, I'm sure he would be proud. Anthony looked at the horizon, where the sun was setting, painting the sky golden. The old blue pickup truck was still parked there, a constant reminder of his roots and values. But now it was no longer a symbol of forced humility, but of a conscious choice of someone who knows that a person's true value isn't in what they own, but in what they build together with others. True wealth, Anthony thought, isn't in the size of the ranch or the bank balance, but in the ability to transform lives and fulfill dreams, not just our own, but those of everyone who walks beside us. Dear listeners, we hope that Anthony Thompson's story has touched your hearts and shown that appearances can be deceiving, but character and persistence always prevail. To continue this journey of inspiring stories, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving narratives. Find it here, clicking on the left. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore life's complexity and make us reflect on our values. Share your own stories of overcoming and transformation in the comments. We'd love to hear them. See you in the next video.